Hi everyone, it's Dr. Parker. We're going to do an introduction to the Clerk's Tale, and if you thought that the if you thought the Nun's Priest Tale had some unconventional or unattractive views about women, I'm just can't wait to hear what you say about the Clerk's Tale, and anything you say, you'll be absolutely right. Remember that the clerk from the general prologue is one of maybe the idealized characters of Chaucer. That he is a very devoted student and he loves books, and that he doesn't say much except when he does, it's very wise. He said no more words than were needed, it says. So, take that for what you will. If we're looking at the credibility of the tellers and the way that Chaucer sets them up to go with the tales, he has a pretty good pedigree. I mean, he's held up as being a fairly erudite and wise person, although we can we certainly debate that. The Clerk's Tale is not original to Chaucer, the Griselda story. There are actually several sources, and probably the one that Chaucer takes from is Boccaccio's Decameron. If you'll remember, that's also where he got his prototype for the Knight's Tale, is from the Decameron. Here's a nice pre-Raphaelite picture of the beautiful young people telling stories to each other. They had left Venice to escape the plague and passed their days in the countryside telling stories. And the Griselda story is one of those. Griselda and Gualtieri, or Griselda and Walter, depending on what translation you want to read. So Chaucer had translated this. He had read Boccaccio's Decameron. He had translated a great deal of it. So this one sticks fairly closely to the original with, a few stylistic changes, but no major plot changes, really. So here we have her, the patient Griselda, and she is a subject of great debate and controversy because clearly the teller of the tale has her as sort of a saint, that she is as good gets, and she is otherworldly in her patience and her goodness. I think that now we'd have a problem with her being such a doormat about herself, but especially the fact that she allows her children to be taken off and presumably murdered, although that's eventually we find out that's not what happened. And while I suppose you can let someone be the author of their own demise, and if she wants to put up with Walter, that's fine. I don't think we would have any sympathy whatsoever with her allowing her children to be taken off, that we would assume that she would need to jump in and die herself rather than let these children be taken off. I guess that the teller of this tale doesn't agree that the wife's role is wife first and mother second, and that with those two things come into conflict, her role as mother has got to be the one that supersedes. That's very hard for us to take in the 21st century, because we've got, on the one hand, all kinds of stories of deadbeat parents of one gender or another running off, and the children are what matters. The children are what we sort of sacrifice everything for. So this idea that in her marriage she should be willing to give up these children is abhorrent to us. It's clearly not abhorrent to the clerk. And I can also tell you this story and versions of this story were hugely popular in the Middle Ages. The Griselda story is one of the most retold stories. It's one of the ones where the most manuscripts survive. People loved it. And whether they loved it to wonder at it and how awful it is, or out of true admiration, it's hard to say. But Griselda, like I say, from our point of view, Griselda is kind of a doormat, and if she's patiently suffering, she's misguided at best. I think, on the other hand, that the audience, or at least the narrator, and maybe some of the audience, is a little bit more admiring of her. This is kind of a nice pre-Raphaelite study of Griselda by Cooper. It's one of his sketches and then his final rendering. But I think it makes for a nice side by side, because remember, Griselda is poor at the beginning of the tale. She's just a poor man's daughter. She has no aspirations to greatness, and at the end she is, or thinks that she is, being returned to this poverty. And she's equally sort of happy and resigned in either position, either being rich or poor. The only thing she wants is to make her husband happy and to serve God. And presumably she thinks that by serving her husband, she's serving God. I don't know. I mean, and of course her patience is rewarded in the end. But this is a fairy tale. I mean, how do we know it's going to work out? How do we know it's going to, if this were a real life situation, how would we be expected to hope for the best for this one? Which kind of brings me to the next point, which is Walter. This is not really a picture of Walter, but it's kind of how I imagine him. It is unfathomable that this guy would treat his wife this way. So let's go back and talk about him for a second. He is known throughout his life as a good leader, as a good and kind ruler, as being wise, and people like everything about him except for the fact that he won't get married and have an heir, and they're very concerned with the succession, which is sensible throughout English literature in times when people were worried whether the king or queen was going to have an heir. There come these pieces of literature that are about succession. And so his people nagged him, and he said, well, I will marry, but you have to let me choose. And he chooses Griselda, and it's not made especially clear how he knows about her, being that she's a poor woman from the village, or anything like that, but he does know about her. And so we have this really bizarre, kind of ritualistic surprise wedding that he throws for her. She doesn't even know she's going to get married or know that he exists. And he parades down the street, and she comes out of her house to watch the beautiful procession. And it turns out that she's the bride. But you will notice that one of the things that happens is that they strip her naked in the street, presumably, and adorn her with her new sort of royal clothes. And so even though she is dressed up in these rich and beautiful clothes, there's this moment of what I think she probably would see as extreme humiliation. I don't know what I think about the sexualization of that moment. I mean, I think there's something going on, but I'm not sure exactly what it's meant to be. And then, of course, at the end, there is this reverse of the ritual where she's going to be sent. She says she wants to be sent back to her father's naked, but for modesty, she wants to wear a shift. And a shift is nothing but it's like a slip. It's a very thin garment. It's up through even the early 20th century, to see a woman in her shift was a little bit indecent. There's the famous play, The Playboy of the Western World, written in Ireland by John Millington Synge, caused controversy and riots in the street when the female character she wasn't even seen in her shift, but it was mentioned that she had been seen wearing just her shift. So Griselda strips herself sort of back down, and of course for her, I think it's a ritual throwing off of everything that Walter has given her. But I think the ceremony at the beginning, where he sort of surprises her in the street and has her undressed, is really odd. And so the fits he has of wanting to test her are described in just that way, as if he has a fit. They're called sicknesses. And one thing I will say, I mean, the narrator goes to great pains, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, to say he does not condone what Walter does. Walter is not right to do this. Walter does not have the right to test his wife this way. It was a fit of madness. It was an illness. It's interesting that Chaucer talks about this mental illness using the term of illness or sickness, which is actually kind of a forward-thinking way to think about mental illness for him. I think the main thing to remember about what Walter's doing is that it's the plot device. I mean, this is how Griselda gets tested in this kind of Job-like way. But of course, Walter's not God, and Walter's not meant to be God. So I don't quite know what to do with it. But he is such the problematic character, and equally problematic in the end when he sort of says, "Haha, everything's okay," and this 12-year-old girl you thought I was going to marry, and I have you making up her bed is actually your daughter. And they lived happily ever after. It just stretches, I don't know, whatever faculty of forgiveness or imagination you might have, it stretches it to the extreme. So, but that's Walter. I mean, and I said Walter's actions have to happen for the plot to happen, but they are so bizarre and hard to explain. Um, so let's talk about the ways in which Chaucer sort of tries to get himself off the hook, or maybe the clerk and maybe Chaucer, depending on how you want to read it. Um, so if we're talking about the themes, and the themes, there's a theme of patience, of course. There's a theme that if you endure adversity, all will be well in the end. Is there a model of marriage being presented, though, I guess is the question. And certainly not a model for the husbands, but is there a model for wives? This is how you're supposed to be. So first off, towards the end of the tale, the clerk says, we've got this little snippet cut out here. The story is not told so that wives should follow Griselda, as in humility, because that would be impossible even if they wanted to, but that every person, every creature, so man, woman, child, in his degree should be constant in adversity, as was Griselda. Therefore, Petrarch wrote this story, which he put together in a high style. Because since a woman was so patient unto a mortal man, much more should we receive all that God sends us happily, because he made everything with great skill. So the first little thing here, the clerk says, is this story is a parable. It's not a model for marriage, he says. Although I don't, again, this is, I don't know if this is him trying to get himself out of Dutch with the prioress at the end of the story, or what it is. No, not the prioress. I'm sorry. This is the clerk. We're just trying to get him out of Dutch with all the women on the pilgrimage. But he does say that this is not a parable of marriage. This is a parable of accepting adversity patiently. But nevertheless, if you read it as a parable, it still puts Walter in the position of God. So the husband kind of as God. But to go a little further, so here's the envoy. The envoy is kind of a technical term for just sort of a little epilogue, I guess. A little sort of author's statement at the end of a piece of writing. And this in the manuscript it says l'envoi de Chaucer. It's the envoy of Chaucer, but it's written as if it's the clerk saying it. And I think the clerk has realized that he's told kind of a grim story that's not very happy for the women. And he specifically mentions the wife of Bath. He says, "Oh, listen, I think you wives should be more like the wife of Bath than like Griselda." So here's his little envoy. He says, "Griselda is dead, and also her patience, and they're both buried together in Italy. And I cry out in open audience, no wedded man should be so foolish as to try his wife's patience, to find her to be like Griselda, because certainly he will fail. O noble wives, full of high wisdom, don't let humility nail down your tongue. Don't let a clerk have any cause to write a story about you as of Griselda. In other words, don't be like her. Don't be so heroic and saintly in your patience with your husbands that a clerk can write a story about you this way." And he's got this nice line, lest Shishavash swallow you in her entrails. Shishavash is this mythical French cow who only eats good wives, and as a result is starving to death. So Shishavash is supposed to be very, very lean and thin. And so the clerk's saying, don't be like Griselda. You don't want to be such a patient and obedient wife that Shishavash eats you. He says, rather, follow Echo, who holds no silence but ever answers at the contrary. So be like an echo. When your husband says something, say something back to him. Don't be bedaft because of your innocence, but take governance on yourself. Don't let your husbands cow you. Don't be so naive and innocent that you think you have to do whatever they say. Imprint well this lesson in your mind because it'll be for the common profit. It will help you and your husband. Your marriage will be better. So it's interesting. He tells this whole story of this bizarre marriage and Griselda's patience. But he ends with this little, but I don't think wives should be silent. I don't think you should be cowed by your husband. I think you should talk back. Now, whether he's afraid that he's about to be beaten by the wife of Bath, or whether he actually thinks this, or I don't know. I don't know what I think about this. And how much of this is the clerk and how much of it is Chaucer. If you think back to Chaucer's prologue to the Miller's Tale, where he said, don't blame the miller. Or he said, I'm sorry, well, the miller says, don't blame me, blame the beer. Chaucer says, don't blame me, blame the miller, if you don't like this story. So Chaucer is tongue-in-cheek, kind of trying to get himself out of trouble a little bit here again. I like this little section. So, all right, so that's the Clerk's Tale. It's an odd one to be sure. And again, I'll just give you the heads up that the Franklin's Tale is going to make everybody feel better about marriage and women and Chaucer's view and everything like that. I'll post some questions. It's Sunday, either tonight or tomorrow, and I'll look forward once again to seeing what you all have to say.